London, England, March 1817. The morning sun cast golden rays through the towering windows of Pemberton House, one of Mayfair's most prestigious Georgian mansions. Crystal chandeliers caught the light, sending rainbows dancing across marble floors that had witnessed decades of aristocratic gatherings. In the grand drawing room, portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to judge every movement within these hallowed walls. Lady Mirabel Pemberton, 22 years of age and possessed of a beauty that had launched 1,000 whispered conversations across London's finest salons, stood before her reflection in an ornate French mirror. Her auburn hair cascaded in carefully arranged ringlets, and her emerald eyes held a spark of rebellion that no amount of proper upbringing had managed to extinguish. The empire waistgown she wore, crafted from the finest lion's silk in deep sapphire blue, was the height of fashion, yet she regarded it with something approaching disdain. "Another day, another performance," she murmured to her lady's maid, Agnes, who was adjusting the delicate seed pearls adorning Mirabel's décolletage. Agnes, a woman of 45 with knowing eyes and discretion born of years serving the Pemberton family, merely nodded. She had witnessed Lady Mirabel's growing restlessness over the past months, watching as her young mistress chafed against the invisible chains of societal expectation. The year 1817 was a time of unprecedented prosperity for England's upper classes. The Napoleonic Wars had ended, bringing with them a flood of returning officers and a renewed appetite for grand entertainments. The season had become more elaborate than ever before, with each hostess attempting to outshine her rivals through increasingly spectacular displays of wealth and refinement. Yet beneath this glittering surface, rigid protocols governed every aspect of aristocratic life. A lady of quality was expected to rise at a proper hour, never before 10 in the morning. She would breakfast on delicate fare, perhaps coddled eggs, thin toast, and hot chocolate served in the finest bone china. Her mornings were occupied with correspondence, written in an elegant hand on paper bearing her family's crest. Letters to friends discussing the previous evening's entertainment, notes of thanks for invitations received, and carefully worded responses to social obligations that could not be ignored. The afternoon brought visiting hours, when ladies would receive callers in their drawing rooms. These visits followed an intricate dance of etiquette, calling cards left on silver salvers, conversations that touched upon approved topics while carefully avoiding any hint of controversy or impropriety. A lady's reputation could be destroyed by a single misstep, a careless word, or association with someone deemed unsuitable by society's arbiters of moral behavior. Evenings were the crown jewel of aristocratic existence. Dinner parties with courses numbering in the dozens, each dish a masterpiece of culinary art. Servants in elaborate livery moved silently through dining rooms adorned with ancestral silver and crystal that caught the light of hundreds of candles. Conversations flowed like fine wine, touching upon literature, art, and the carefully orchestrated gossip that kept society's wheels turning. But it was the balls that truly defined the season. These spectacular events transformed grand mansions into fairy tale settings. Ballrooms gleamed with polish, their floors perfect mirrors reflecting the swirling colors of silk gowns and the gold braid of military uniforms. Orchestras played from hidden galleries, their music weaving through conversations conducted in French, the language of refinement and diplomatic intrigue. Lady Mirabel had been raised within this world of privilege and protocol. Her father, the Earl of Pemberton, was a man of impeccable lineage whose ancestors had served English monarchs for centuries. Her mother, the Countess, was renowned for her adherence to propriety and her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. Yet their daughter had always possessed a restless spirit that questioned the very foundations upon which their world was built. The Pemberton family tree stretched back to the Norman conquest, its branches heavy with titles, honors, and accumulated wealth. Their London mansion occupied an entire corner of Grosvenor Square, its facade a testament to Georgian architectural perfection. Inside, rooms flowed one into another in a symphony of luxury, Chinese silk wallpaper depicting exotic birds and flowering trees, aubusson carpets in jewel tones, furniture crafted by the finest cabinetmakers in England and France. The family's country estate, Pemberton Hall in Gloucestershire, encompassed thousands of acres of rolling parkland designed by Capability Brown himself. Ancient oak trees provided shade for grazing sheep, while formal gardens displayed the geometric precision beloved by landscape architects of the previous century. The house itself was a Palladian masterpiece, its columns and pediments speaking to classical ideals of proportion and beauty. Yet for all this magnificence, Lady Mirabel felt increasingly confined by the golden cage of her birth. She had received the finest education available to a woman of her station, instruction in French and Italian, watercolor painting, pianoforte, and the delicate art of flower arranging. She could discourse knowledgeably on approved literature, maintain elegant conversation for hours without saying anything of substance, and navigate the complex precedents that govern seating arrangements at formal dinners. But these accomplishments felt hollow when measured against her secret longings for adventure, for authentic emotion, for experiences that transcended the careful boundaries of respectable society. She had read the scandalous novels hidden in the lending libraries, stories of passionate love that defied convention and heroines who dared to follow their hearts rather than their heads. The morning's routine proceeded with clockwork precision. Agnes assisted her mistress with her toilette, applying just enough rouge to enhance Mirabel's natural coloring without appearing painted. A light dusting of powder, a touch of cherry lip salve, and a delicate application of lavender water completed the transformation. The final touch was jewelry, the Pemberton emeralds, a suite of necklace, earrings, and bracelet that had belonged to generations of countesses before her. As Mirabel descended the grand staircase to breakfast, her silk skirts rustling against the polished mahogany banister, she could not have imagined that this seemingly ordinary morning would mark the beginning of the most scandalous chapter in her family's distinguished history. The event set in motion this day would shake the very foundations of London society and force her to choose between the security of conformity and the dangerous allure of authentic passion. The breakfast room at Pemberton House was a study in refined elegance, its walls adorned with hand-painted Chinese silk depicting delicate cherry blossoms and exotic birds. Morning light streamed through tall windows overlooking the private garden, where precisely manicured topiary provided a backdrop of green tranquility. The mahogany table gleamed with family silver, each piece bearing the Pemberton crest, a lion rampant surrounded by oak leaves, symbol of strength and endurance that had represented the family for 7 centuries. Lady Mirabel entered to find her parents already seated, the Earl immersed in the Times while the Countess reviewed the morning's correspondence with her secretary, Mrs. Thornfield. The Earl of Pemberton was a distinguished man of 58, his bearing erect despite the silver threading through his dark hair. His reputation in Parliament was unassailable, his speeches on matters of trade and diplomacy quoted in the finest drawing rooms across London. This morning he wore a perfectly tailored coat of midnight blue superfine wool, his cravat arranged in the intricate style favored by Beau Brummel himself. The Countess presented a picture of maternal authority tempered by genuine affection for her daughter. At 52, she retained the grace that had made her the toast of her own season 3 decades earlier. Her morning dress of lavender silk was cut in the latest fashion, its high waist emphasizing her still elegant figure. Around her throat nestled a simple strand of pearls, their lustrous surface catching the light as she moved her head to study each invitation and social obligation that demanded her attention. "Good morning, Mama, Papa," Mirabel said, accepting the chair held by Jameson, the elderly butler who had served the family since before her birth. His livery was immaculate, from the powder in his hair to the gleaming buttons on his emerald green coat. Every member of the Pemberton household staff reflected the family's exacting standards, their uniforms and deportment a silent testament to the order that governed aristocratic life. "My dear," the Countess replied, setting aside a cream-colored invitation bordered in gold. "You look particularly lovely this morning. That shade of blue is most becoming with your coloring." She paused to study her daughter with the practiced eye of a woman who understood that appearance was both armor and weapon in the delicate warfare of society. "I have received the most interesting invitation. Lady Blackwood is hosting a masked ball at Blackwood Manor next Friday evening. The theme is to be classical antiquity, and she has promised entertainments that will surprise even the most jaded members of our circle." The Earl looked up from his newspaper, his grey eyes sharp with interest. Lord Blackwood was a man whose wealth exceeded even that of many dukes, his fortune built upon shrewd investments in shipping and manufacturing that had flourished during the recent wars. More importantly, his political influence was considerable, his opinion sought by ministers and ambassadors alike. An invitation to Blackwood Manor was not merely a social courtesy but a mark of significant favor. "Lady Blackwood's entertainments are always memorable," the Earl said carefully, his tone suggesting familiarity with the lady's reputation for pushing the boundaries of conventional hospitality. "She has a talent for creating events that become the talk of London for months afterward. I trust she maintains appropriate standards, despite her innovative approach to entertainment." Lady Mirabel felt a flutter of excitement at her father's words. She had heard whispers about Lady Blackwood's soirees, gatherings where the usual rigid protocols were relaxed in favor of intellectual discourse and artistic appreciation that bordered on the unconventional. The widow of Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, she had inherited not only his vast fortune but also his collection of classical sculptures and Renaissance paintings that decorated her mansion with an opulence that some deemed excessive. "What manner of surprises might we expect?" Mirabel asked, attempting to keep her voice level despite the quickening of her pulse. The prospect of an evening that promised something beyond the usual round of polite conversation and carefully choreographed dancing was intoxicating. The Countess exchanged a meaningful glance with her husband before responding. "Lady Blackwood has commissioned a series of tableaux vivants depicting scenes from classical mythology. The participants will wear costumes designed to represent figures from ancient Greece and Rome. It promises to be an evening of unprecedented artistic sophistication." Mrs. Thornfield, a spinster of indeterminate age whose efficiency was matched only by her discretion, cleared her throat delicately. "If I may, your ladyship, the invitation specifies that costumes should reflect the artistic sensibilities of classical antiquity. Lady Blackwood has engaged Madame Rousseau to provide guidance on historically accurate representations." Madame Rousseau was London's most sought-after modiste, a French émigré whose understanding of fashion was matched by her knowledge of art history. Her salon in Bond Street had become a gathering place for ladies who prided themselves on their aesthetic sophistication. The prospect of being dressed by Madame Rousseau for such an exclusive event was thrilling beyond measure. As the family continued their breakfast of coddled eggs, deviled kidneys, and fresh strawberry preserves, the conversation turned to the practicalities of preparing for such an elaborate entertainment. The Countess would need to consult with their own modiste about a suitable costume, while ensuring that any design met the exacting standards of propriety that governed public appearances by members of their family. Yet beneath the surface of these mundane considerations, each member of the Pemberton family felt the electric anticipation that preceded events of true significance. The Earl recognized an opportunity to strengthen political alliances while enjoying the finest entertainment London could offer. The Countess saw a chance to reinforce her family's position at the apex of society while indulging her genuine appreciation for artistic beauty. And Lady Mirabel sensed the possibility of an evening that might offer the authentic emotional experience for which she had been unconsciously yearning. The morning proceeded with visits from various tradespeople and social obligations. The florist arrived with arrangements of hothouse roses and exotic orchids that would grace the drawing room for the afternoon's receiving hours. The wine merchant presented selections from the Pemberton cellars for the Earl's approval, ensuring that any entertainment offered by the family would reflect their impeccable taste and limitless resources. Lady Mirabel spent the hours between breakfast and luncheon in her private sitting room, a feminine sanctuary decorated in shades of rose and cream. Here she maintained her correspondence, practiced her watercolors, and indulged in the novels that provided her only escape from the golden monotony of privilege. This morning, however, she found herself unable to concentrate on the Gothic romance that had previously captivated her attention. Instead, her thoughts returned repeatedly to Lady Blackwood's promised entertainment. She had seen examples of tableaux vivants at other grand houses, carefully staged scenes where costumed participants posed motionlessly to represent famous paintings or mythological stories. Yet something in her mother's tone suggested that Lady Blackwood's interpretation of this fashionable amusement might venture into territory that other hostesses would consider too daring for respectable society. The afternoon brought the usual round of visitors, each arrival announced by Jameson with the ceremonial precision that transformed social calls into ritual observances. Lady Fairfax, the Countess's dearest friend and most reliable source of society intelligence, brought news of the recent engagement between Lord Ashford's daughter and the younger son of the Duke of Worthington. Mrs. Pemberton Wells, a distant cousin whose husband's military service had elevated her family to the fringes of acceptable society, shared gossip about a scandal involving a certain marchioness and her husband's French secretary. But the most intriguing visitor was Lady Catherine Sinclair, a young woman of Mirabel's age whose beauty was matched by her reputation for unconventional opinions. The daughter of a Scottish earl whose fortune derived from progressive agricultural improvements, she possessed an independence of thought that occasionally bordered on the shocking. Her arrival brought an energy that immediately enlivened the carefully modulated atmosphere of the Pemberton drawing-room. "Mirabel, my dear!" Lady Catherine exclaimed, embracing her friend with an enthusiasm that would have horrified the more rigid arbiters of proper behavior. "Have you heard about Lady Blackwood's masked ball? The entire city is buzzing with speculation about what she might have planned. Some say she has commissioned costumes that would make even Venus herself blush with modesty." The week preceding Lady Blackwood's masked ball passed in a whirlwind of preparation that consumed the attention of London's most fashionable circles. In drawing-rooms across Mayfair and Belgravia, conversations revolved around the mysterious entertainment that promised to surpass even the most memorable social events of recent memory. Speculation ran rampant about the nature of the classical tableaux, the identity of the participants, and the degree to which Lady Blackwood might test the boundaries of respectable society. Lady Mirabel found herself caught between anticipation and anxiety as Madame Rousseau's assistants fitted her for a costume that promised to transform her into Diana, goddess of the hunt. The design was breathtaking in its artistry, layers of flowing silk in shades of silver and pearl that would catch the light with every movement. The bodice was cut lower than anything Mirabel had ever worn, its classical drapery following the lines of ancient Roman statuary that Madame Rousseau had studied in the British Museum's collection. "Mademoiselle must understand," Madame Rousseau explained in her precise English, colored by the faintest trace of her native French accent, that classical costume requires a different approach to modesty than our contemporary fashion. The ancient Greeks and Romans celebrated the human form as the highest expression of divine beauty. To accurately represent Diana, we must honor their aesthetic principles while maintaining the dignity appropriate to a lady of your station. The costume was undeniably magnificent, but its authenticity came at the cost of conventional propriety. The flowing lines and classical drapery revealed more of the female form than any respectable lady would normally display in public. Yet the overall effect was so artistic, so obviously inspired by the finest examples of classical sculpture, that it seemed to transcend ordinary considerations of modesty through its very beauty and cultural sophistication. The Countess attended these fittings with careful attention, her experienced eye evaluating not only the costume's aesthetic merits but also its potential impact on her daughter's reputation. She understood that Lady Blackwood's invitation represented both an extraordinary opportunity and a significant risk. The widow's position in society was unique, her wealth and connections made her too powerful to ignore, yet her unconventional entertainments occasionally tested the patience of the most rigid social authorities. "The effect is certainly striking," the Countess murmured, studying her daughter's reflection in Madame Rousseau's fitting-room mirrors. The classical inspiration is unmistakable, and the craftsmanship is exquisite. Yet I cannot help but wonder whether such authenticity might be misunderstood by those less appreciative of artistic merit. Lady Catherine Sinclair, who had been fitted for the role of Athena, goddess of wisdom, shared none of these concerns. Her costume was equally magnificent, draped silk in ivory and gold, with a bronze breastplate that had been crafted by the finest metalworkers in London. A helmet adorned with plumes completed the ensemble, creating an effect that was both martial and feminine, powerful yet graceful. "My dear Countess," Catherine said with characteristic directness, "surely the pursuit of authentic artistic expression must occasionally require us to challenge conventional expectations. The greatest art has always pushed boundaries, forced viewers to reconsider their assumptions about beauty, propriety, and truth. Lady Blackwood is offering us the opportunity to participate in something truly extraordinary, a living gallery that celebrates the finest achievements of classical civilization." The days leading up to the ball brought additional revelations about the scope of Lady Blackwood's ambitions. Whispers circulated about the transformation of Blackwood Manor's principal rooms into settings that would transport guests to ancient Athens and Rome. Master craftsmen had been commissioned to create architectural elements that would complement the living tableaus, columns of faux marble, painted backdrops depicting classical landscapes, and lighting effects that would enhance the theatrical atmosphere. More intriguing still were the rumors about the guest list. Lady Blackwood had invited not only the cream of London society but also artists, writers, and intellectuals whose presence would elevate the evening beyond mere entertainment into genuine cultural significance. The portrait painter Sir Joshua Reynolds had agreed to attend, along with several members of the Royal Academy. Even Lord Byron, whose scandalous reputation made him persona non grata at many respectable gatherings, was said to have accepted an invitation. The inclusion of such controversial figures added an element of danger to the evening's promise. Byron's presence would guarantee that every word spoken, every gesture made, every costume worn would be scrutinized for signs of impropriety or scandal. Yet this very risk made the prospect of attendance all the more thrilling for those members of society who craved experiences that transcended the predictable round of conventional entertainments. Lady Mirabel's final fitting took place on the Thursday before the ball, in Madame Rousseau's private salon where the most exclusive clients received personal attention from the legendary modiste herself. The completed costume was a masterpiece of classical inspiration and contemporary craftsmanship. The silver silk seemed to capture moonlight in its folds, while the careful draping created an effect that was both modest and revealing, classical and contemporary. "Magnifique," Madame Rousseau declared, stepping back to admire her creation. "You embody the very spirit of Diana, beautiful, powerful, independent. The goddess who answered to no authority save her own divine nature." The modiste's words carried implications that extended far beyond the realm of costume design, touching upon questions of feminine autonomy that respectable society rarely acknowledged openly. As Mirabel studied her reflection, she felt a transformation taking place that went deeper than mere appearance. The costume seemed to awaken something within her, a sense of her own power and beauty that had been carefully suppressed by years of conventional upbringing. For the first time in her life, she saw herself not as a dutiful daughter whose value lay in her ability to make an advantageous marriage, but as an individual possessed of her own desires, dreams, and destiny. The evening before the ball brought final preparations and mounting excitement throughout fashionable London. In Pemberton House, servants worked late into the night ensuring that every detail of the family's appearance would reflect their exalted status. The Earl's costume as Jupiter, King of the Gods, had been crafted with appropriate magnificence, robes of royal purple and gold, with a crown that incorporated actual diamonds from the family collection. The Countess would appear as Juno, her costume complementing her husband's while asserting her own divine authority. Yet beneath the surface excitement, undercurrents of anxiety troubled the more sensitive members of London society. Those with the keenest social instinct sensed that Lady Blackwood's entertainment might prove to be more than a simple evening of artistic appreciation. The combination of unconventional costumes, controversial guests, and the hostess's known taste for sensation suggested the possibility of an event that could reshape the social landscape in ways both thrilling and dangerous. As Lady Mirabel retired to her chambers on the eve of the ball, her dreams were filled with visions of classical temples, marble statues that came to life in the moonlight, and goddesses who ruled their own destinies without reference to the expectations of mortal society. She could not have imagined that the following evening would indeed prove transformative, but in ways that would challenge everything she had been taught about duty, propriety, and the proper role of women in aristocratic society. The stage was set for an evening that would be remembered long after the last guest had departed, the last candle had been extinguished, and the echoes of scandal had died away. Lady Blackwood's masked ball would become a watershed moment in the social history of Regency London, marking the beginning of changes that would ripple through the highest levels of society for years to come. Friday evening arrived with all the drama of a theatrical premiere, the very air seeming to crackle with anticipation as carriages began their procession toward Blackwood Manor. The mansion itself had been transformed into a vision that surpassed even the most elaborate entertainments of the season. Every window blazed with light from hundreds of candles and crystal chandeliers, while torches lined the circular drive, casting dancing shadows that made the Georgian facade appear to shimmer like a mirage. Lady Mirabel felt her pulse quicken as the Pemberton carriage drew near the entrance, where liveried footmen in classical costume directed the arrival of guests. Through the carriage windows, she could see other vehicles disgorging passengers whose elaborate costumes created a living parade of mythological figures. Gods and goddesses, nymphs and satyrs, heroes and heroines from classical legends stepped down onto red carpet that had been strewn with rose petals in honor of the evening's theme. The transformation of Blackwood Manor's interior was nothing short of breathtaking. The entrance hall had been converted into a Roman atrium, complete with columns of faux marble and a central fountain where water cascaded from the upraised arms of a bronze Neptune. The walls had been draped with silk in deep crimson and gold, while strategic lighting created the illusion of an ancient palace brought to life in modern London. Lady Blackwood herself presided over the entrance of her guests with the majesty of an empress receiving tribute from distant provinces. Her costume as Cleopatra was a masterpiece of theatrical splendor, cloth of gold draped in classical Egyptian style, with a headdress that incorporated genuine pearls and emeralds. Her dark hair had been arranged in elaborate braids adorned with gold ornaments, while kohl-rimmed eyes enhanced her naturally dramatic features. "My dear Lord and Lady Pemberton," she said, extending her hand to be kissed by the Earl while her gaze swept approvingly over their costumes. "You honor my humble entertainment with your presence." And Lady Mirabel. Her eyes lingered on the young woman's transformation into Diana. "Madame Rousseau has outdone herself. You are the very embodiment of classical beauty, the goddess Diana could not be more perfectly represented." As they moved through the reception rooms, Lady Mirabel marveled at the scope of her hostess's vision. Each chamber had been redesigned to represent a different aspect of classical civilization. The main drawing room had become a Greek temple, complete with painted backdrops depicting Mount Olympus. The music room featured a stage where professional actors would later perform scenes from classical drama between the amateur tableaus. The guest list proved to be as extraordinary as the setting. Lord Byron made his entrance as Apollo, his romantic beauty enhanced by a costume of white silk and gold laurel leaves that emphasized his poetic calling. The Duke of Wellington appeared as Mars, god of war, his military bearing lending natural authority to the martial role. Lady Jersey, one of the most powerful patronesses of Almack's, had chosen to represent Venus, her costume of rose silk and pearls creating an effect of mature sensuality that was both appropriate and daring. Yet it was the presence of artists and intellectuals that truly distinguished the evening from ordinary society entertainments. The landscape painter John Constable engaged in earnest conversation with several members of Parliament about the relationship between art and nature. The novelist Maria Edgeworth discussed the portrayal of women in classical literature with a circle of fascinated listeners. Even the controversial philosopher William Godwin had been invited, his presence adding an element of intellectual danger that made every conversation more charged with possibility. As the evening progressed, Lady Mirabel found herself swept into discussions that would have been impossible at conventional gatherings. The classical themes seemed to have loosened the usual constraints of polite conversation, allowing topics that were normally forbidden to emerge into the open. Questions about the role of women in society, the nature of marriage and romantic love, the relationship between individual desire and social duty, all found expression in the guise of discussions about classical mythology and ancient history. Lady Catherine Sinclair, magnificent in her role as Athena, engaged Lord Byron in a spirited debate about the portrayal of goddesses in classical literature. Surely the ancient world understood feminine power in ways that our contemporary society has forgotten, she argued, her eyes flashing with intellectual passion. Diana, Athena, Artemis, these were not passive figures awaiting rescue by male heroes, but active agents of their own destinies. Byron, clearly delighted by such unconventional conversation from a respectable young lady, responded with characteristic wit. Indeed, my dear goddess of wisdom, the ancients understood that true beauty requires independence of spirit. A woman who merely conforms to external expectations can never achieve the sublime. His words carried implications that went far beyond literary criticism, touching upon questions of feminine autonomy that were rarely acknowledged in polite society. The formal tableaux began at 10 o'clock, with Lady Blackwood presenting a series of living pictures that surpassed anything previously attempted in London society. The first depicted the Judgment of Paris, with 3 magnificent women representing the competing goddesses while a handsome young man in classical drapery chose between them. The poses were drawn directly from Renaissance paintings, the costumes authentic to classical models, yet the overall effect was undeniably sensual in its celebration of human beauty. Lady Mirabel participated in a tableau representing Diana and her nymphs bathing in a forest pool. The scene required her to pose with several other young women in costumes that, while artistically justifiable, revealed more of the female form than any of them had ever displayed in public. The classical drapery, designed to suggest the freedom of movement possessed by goddesses, left arms, shoulders, and portions of the décolletage uncovered in ways that would have been scandalous in contemporary dress. Yet the artistic context seemed to transform potential impropriety into something approaching the sacred. The lighting, the musical accompaniment, the serious attention of the audience, all combined to create an atmosphere where beauty was appreciated for its own sake rather than judged by conventional moral standards. For perhaps the first time in her life, Lady Mirabel felt her own physical beauty not as a commodity to be carefully managed in the marriage market, but as a source of personal power and artistic expression. The evening's most controversial moment came with the final tableau, a representation of Venus rising from the sea, performed by Lady Blackwood herself. The costume, or rather the suggestion of costume, consisted of strategically draped silk that created the illusion of nudity while technically maintaining modesty. The effect was breathtaking in its beauty and shocking in its boldness, pushing the boundaries of acceptable behavior further than any respectable entertainment had dared. A collective gasp arose from the audience as Lady Blackwood took her pose, her arms raised gracefully above her head while silk drapery suggested the foam of the sea from which Venus emerged. The tableau lasted only minutes, but its impact was immediate and lasting. Some guests applauded with genuine appreciation for the artistic achievement, while others exchanged scandalized whispers about the appropriateness of such displays at gatherings attended by unmarried young ladies. Lord Byron was heard to murmur that the evening had achieved a perfect synthesis of classical beauty and contemporary sophistication, while several of the more conservative attendees made their disapproval known through studied silence and early departures. The Countess of Pemberton found herself torn between admiration for the artistic achievement and concern about the potential consequences for her daughter's reputation. As the formal entertainment concluded and guests moved into the supper rooms, Lady Mirabel realized that the evening had fundamentally changed her understanding of herself and her place in society. The experience of participating in the tableaux, of being admired for her beauty and artistic expression rather than simply her marriageability, had awakened desires and ambitions that could never again be easily suppressed. She had tasted freedom, however briefly, and the flavor was intoxicating beyond measure. The immediate aftermath of Lady Blackwood's masked ball rippled through London society like a stone cast into still water, creating circles of consequence that expanded far beyond the walls of the magnificent manor. By dawn on Saturday morning, accounts of the evening's entertainments had spread through the network of servants, coachmen, and tradespeople who formed the invisible infrastructure of aristocratic life. What began as whispered reports among ladies' maids and footmen quickly escalated into public scandal that reached the drawing rooms of the most powerful families in England. Lady Mirabel awoke to find Agnes standing beside her bed with an expression of barely concealed distress. The loyal maid had received early intelligence from her network of domestic contacts throughout Mayfair, and the news was deeply troubling. Several prominent families had already begun distancing themselves from guests who had participated too enthusiastically in Lady Blackwood's classical entertainments. "My lady," Agnes said carefully, her voice lower than usual as if the very walls might carry tales, "there has been considerable talk about last evening's festivities. The Duchess of Marlborough's household is saying that certain tableaux went beyond the bounds of proper artistic expression. Lady Castlereagh has reportedly declared that no respectable hostess should have subjected unmarried young ladies to such exposure." The Earl of Pemberton's reaction was swift and decisive. A man whose political career depended upon maintaining an irreproachable reputation, he summoned his daughter to his private study immediately after breakfast. The room, lined with leather-bound volumes and portraits of distinguished ancestors, had always been a sanctuary of masculine authority where important family decisions were made with careful deliberation. "Mirabel," he began, his tone carrying the weight of paternal concern and aristocratic responsibility, "I have received visits from several gentlemen this morning, all expressing varying degrees of concern about last evening's entertainment. It appears that Lady Blackwood's interpretation of classical themes has been deemed excessive by certain influential members of society." The specific nature of these concerns became clear as the morning progressed. Lord Castlereagh, the Foreign Secretary himself, had dispatched his private secretary with a discreet inquiry about the Pemberton family's continued association with Lady Blackwood. The Duke of Wellington, despite his own participation in the evening's festivities, had expressed reservations about the appropriateness of such entertainments for unmarried young ladies of good family. Most damaging of all was the reaction of the patronesses of Almack's, those 7 powerful women who controlled access to London's most exclusive social institution. Lady Jersey, despite her own participation as Venus, had been forced to distance herself from the evening's more controversial elements under pressure from her more conservative colleagues. Almack's assembly rooms represented the pinnacle of social respectability, and exclusion from its weekly gatherings could destroy a young woman's prospects more effectively than any financial scandal. The Countess attempted to minimize the damage through careful social maneuvering, dispatching notes to her most trusted friends that emphasized the classical educational value of the entertainment while subtly suggesting that rumors had exaggerated its more sensational aspects. Yet she could not deny that her daughter's participation in the tableaux had been more visible and more memorable than prudence might have dictated. "The pose you struck as Diana was undeniably magnificent," she admitted during a private conversation in Mirabel's sitting room. "Madame Rousseau's costume was a work of art, and your natural grace brought the classical figure to life in ways that were genuinely moving. Yet I fear that some observers focused more upon the authenticity of the classical drapery than upon its artistic merits." Lady Catherine Sinclair faced even greater scrutiny due to her family's Scottish origins and her own reputation for unconventional opinions. The English aristocracy had always viewed their Scottish counterparts with some suspicion, and Catherine's enthusiastic participation in the classical tableaux had provided ammunition for those who questioned whether foreign influences were corrupting the pure traditions of English society. "My father has received a letter from his London banker," Catherine confided during an afternoon visit to Pemberton House, suggesting that certain business associates might prefer to limit their dealings with families whose reputations have been compromised by association with controversial entertainments. The implications for our family's financial interests could be severe if this scandal continues to grow. Yet the most unexpected consequence of the evening was the attention it attracted from literary and artistic circles that normally remain separate from fashionable society. Lord Byron, inspired by the classical themes and the bold beauty of the tableaus, had begun composing verses that celebrated the fusion of ancient ideals with contemporary feminine grace. His poem, The Goddess Unveiled, would eventually become one of his most quoted works, though its explicit celebration of female beauty and independence would also contribute to its controversial reception. The portrait painter Sir Thomas Lawrence approached Lord Pemberton with a request to paint Lady Mirabel in her Diana costume, arguing that such a work would capture a moment of unique cultural significance while establishing her as a patron of serious artistic endeavor. The commission would be prestigious beyond measure, as Lawrence was considered the finest portraitist of his generation, but it would also ensure that the memory of the controversial evening would be preserved in permanent form for future generations to judge. The artistic merit of such a portrait cannot be questioned, the Earl mused during a family conference in the drawing room. Lawrence's work hangs in the finest collections throughout Europe, and his subjects are invariably elevated in public estimation by association with his genius. Yet I cannot ignore the possibility that commissioning such a work might be interpreted as defiant approval of the entire evening's entertainment. As the week progressed, the scandal took on increasingly political dimensions. Conservative members of Parliament began using Lady Blackwood's ball as an example of moral decay among the aristocracy, suggesting that French revolutionary ideas about feminine equality were corrupting traditional English values. Liberal voices countered by defending the evening as a celebration of classical learning and artistic appreciation that demonstrated England's cultural sophistication. The religious establishment also entered the controversy, with several prominent clergymen delivering sermons that condemned the revival of pagan themes and the public display of the human form as evidence of society's drift away from Christian virtue. The Bishop of London himself was reported to have expressed concerns about the influence of classical art upon impressionable young minds. Lady Mirabel found herself at the center of a storm that extended far beyond questions of personal reputation to touch upon fundamental debates about the role of women in society, the relationship between art and morality, and the proper balance between tradition and innovation in English cultural life. Letters arrived daily from strangers offering everything from marriage proposals to moral condemnation, while her every public appearance was scrutinized for signs of either repentance or defiance. The most painful aspect of the scandal was its impact upon her closest friendships. Several young ladies who had previously been eager companions now found excuses to avoid her company, their families having decided that association with someone touched by controversy might damage their own matrimonial prospects. The carefully constructed social world that had defined her existence since childhood began to crumble as former allies revealed the conditional nature of their loyalty. Yet the crisis also revealed unexpected sources of support and alliance. Artists, writers, and intellectuals who had previously existed on the margins of respectable society began to seek her acquaintance, drawn by her association with beauty, courage, and artistic innovation. She received invitations to gatherings where conversation flowed freely about topics that would never be addressed in conventional drawing rooms: the nature of love, the rights of women, the relationship between passion and duty. Most significantly, she began to understand that the scandal had liberated her from expectations that had always felt constraining but which she had never before dared to question openly. The possibility of conventional marriage to a respectable gentleman who valued her primarily for her family connections and social position had been seriously compromised, but in its place arose the prospect of relationships based upon genuine intellectual and emotional compatibility. 6 months after Lady Blackwood's scandalous masked ball, London society had settled into a new equilibrium that reflected the fundamental changes wrought by that transformative evening. The immediate furor had subsided, but its consequences continued to reshape the social landscape in ways both subtle and profound. Lady Mirabel Pemberton had emerged from the controversy not as a fallen woman seeking rehabilitation, but as a figure of fascinating complexity who commanded respect even from those who questioned her choices. The commissioned portrait by Sir Thomas Lawrence had become the sensation of the Royal Academy's summer exhibition. Lady Mirabel as Diana drew crowds of viewers who marveled at Lawrence's ability to capture both classical grace and contemporary vitality in a single image. The painting showed Lady Mirabel in her magnificent costume, posed against a background that suggested both the ancient forest sacred to Diana and the manicured parklands of an English estate. Her expression combined the confidence of a goddess with the subtle intelligence of a modern woman who understood her own power. Critics hailed the work as a masterpiece that perfectly embodied the spirit of an age caught between reverence for classical ideals and confidence in contemporary achievement. The conservative faction that had initially condemned the ball found themselves forced to acknowledge the artistic merit of Lawrence's interpretation, while progressive voices celebrated the painting as evidence that English culture could embrace beauty and innovation without abandoning its essential character. The portrait's success had transformed Lady Mirabel's position in society from that of a scandalized participant in questionable entertainment to that of a patron and muse whose association with serious art elevated her above ordinary considerations of propriety. Requests for her attendance at artistic gatherings, literary salons, and cultural events arrived daily, making her one of the most sought-after guests in intellectual circles. Her friendship with Lord Byron had deepened into something approaching romantic attachment, though both were too sophisticated to allow such feelings to develop into anything that might compromise either party's independence. Their correspondence, filled with discussions of literature, philosophy, and the nature of authentic experience, had become the stuff of legend among those privileged to glimpse its contents. Byron's poem cycle, The Classical Muse, inspired by their intellectual friendship, would eventually be recognized as among his finest work. "You have achieved something remarkable," Byron told her during one of their afternoon walks in Hyde Park, where they had become a familiar sight that drew curious glances from other promenaders. "You have transformed scandal into triumph, criticism into celebrity, controversy into cultural significance." The ancient Diana herself could not have handled her transformation from maiden to goddess with greater skill. The Earl and Countess of Pemberton had initially struggled to understand their daughter's metamorphosis, but gradually came to appreciate the unique position she had carved out for herself. Her association with distinguished artists and writers had elevated the family's cultural reputation, while her obvious happiness and confidence demonstrated that unconventional choices could lead to personal fulfillment that transcended traditional measures of success. "I confess that your path has not been the one your mother and I envisioned," the Earl admitted during a private conversation in his study, where the walls now included a preparatory sketch for Lawrence's famous portrait. "Yet I cannot deny that you have achieved a form of distinction that many young ladies of impeccable reputation might envy. Your name is spoken with respect in circles where intellectual achievement matters more than mere social conformity." Lady Catherine Sinclair had weathered her own share of criticism with characteristic resilience, eventually establishing herself as a prominent advocate for educational reform and women's intellectual development. Her Scottish heritage, initially a liability in the scandal's aftermath, had become an asset as she positioned herself as a bridge between English tradition and broader British innovation. Her essay, On the Classical Education of Women, published anonymously but widely attributed to her, had sparked important discussions about female intellectual capacity. The friendship between Mirabel and Catherine had deepened through their shared experience of social transformation. Their weekly meetings, ostensibly for artistic appreciation but actually encompassing wide-ranging intellectual discussions, had become legendary among London's progressive circles. Young women seeking alternatives to conventional society increasingly sought their guidance and example. Lady Blackwood herself had emerged from the scandal with enhanced rather than diminished reputation, her position as London's most daring hostess now unassailable. Her subsequent entertainments continued to push boundaries while maintaining artistic respectability, creating a new model for social gathering that influenced hostesses throughout England and beyond. She had proven that innovation and tradition could coexist when guided by genuine aesthetic vision and cultural sophistication. The broader impact of the classical revival extended far beyond individual reputations to influence architecture, fashion, and artistic taste throughout the decade. Madame Rousseau's costume designs had inspired a new approach to women's fashion that emphasized classical drapery and natural movement over the rigid structures of traditional formal wear. Young ladies throughout England began requesting gowns that suggested classical inspiration while remaining appropriate for contemporary society. As winter approached and the new season began its cycle of entertainments, Lady Mirabel found herself in the unprecedented position of being able to choose her social engagements based upon genuine interest rather than obligation. Her transformed reputation had freed her from the marriage market's constraints while opening doors to experiences that would have been impossible under conventional circumstances. The final vindication of her choices came with an invitation to attend a private reception for the Prince Regent himself, who had expressed interest in meeting the young woman whose portrait had become the talk of artistic London. The Prince, a notable patron of the arts and appreciator of beauty, greeted her with the respect due to someone who had achieved cultural significance through courage and vision. "Lady Mirabel," he said, bowing over her hand with elaborate courtesy, "your association with classical beauty and artistic innovation has brought honor to English culture. The ancient world produced goddesses of legendary beauty, but none possessed the additional virtue of intellectual sophistication that characterizes the best of our contemporary society." As the evening of the royal reception concluded, Lady Mirabel reflected upon the extraordinary journey that had begun with a scandalous masked ball and culminated in recognition at the highest levels of society. She had learned that authentic self-expression, while initially threatening to conventional expectations, ultimately commanded respect from those capable of recognizing genuine worth. Standing in the portrait gallery of Carlton House, surrounded by images of distinguished women from throughout English history, she understood that her own story had become part of a larger narrative about female agency and cultural evolution. The scandal that had initially threatened to destroy her reputation had instead liberated her to become the woman she was meant to be, independent, intellectual, beautiful, and unashamed of any of these qualities. The classical themes that had inspired Lady Blackwood's entertainment had proven prophetic in ways that none of the participants could have anticipated. Like the goddesses of ancient mythology, Lady Mirabel had undergone a transformation that elevated her beyond ordinary mortal constraints. She had learned that scandal, properly managed, could become a form of power, and that society's initial condemnation could evolve into grudging admiration for those bold enough to chart their own course. As she returned to Pemberton House in the early hours of morning, the same carriage that had carried her to Lady Blackwood's ball now bore a fundamentally different woman, one who had discovered that authentic beauty required not conformity to external expectations, but the courage to embody one's truest self regardless of consequences. The classical education that had seemed merely ornamental in her youth had provided the inspiration for a life that transcended the limitations others might have accepted as inevitable. The story of Lady Mirabel and the scandal of the Nude Ball had become legend, retold in drawing rooms and artistic salons as an example of how individual courage could transform not only personal destiny but the cultural landscape itself. In the end, she had achieved something more valuable than conventional respectability. She had become truly unforgettable, a woman whose name would be remembered long after the social conventions of her era had evolved beyond recognition. The classical goddesses had indeed returned to England, not as marble statues in museum collections, but as living women who dared to claim their own divine right to beauty, intelligence, and independence. Lady Mirabel's transformation was complete, and with it, she had helped transform the very definition of what it meant to be a woman of distinction in the modern age.